You know, life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. For John and Martha Wilson, their story was one most people only dream about. 60 years of marriage, hand in hand through thick and thin. But don't let that fool you. Beneath the surface, there were layers to their lives no one could have guessed. Picture this: a quiet neighborhood in Mississippi, where the air carries the faint scent of roses blooming under the golden hour light. The Wilsons' modest home stood as a testament to decades of love, a place filled with memories. There were wedding photos on the walls, hand-drawn birthday cards from grandchildren pinned proudly to the fridge, and an old record player sitting in the corner, its needle worn down by countless nights of melodies shared between two souls who seemed inseparable. But something felt different that evening. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across their dining table, the atmosphere was heavy, almost like nature itself knew what was coming. Martha sat across from John, her frail hands trembling slightly as she gripped her teacup. Her dark skin glowed softly in the fading light, but her eyes, oh those eyes, held a sadness neither of them had ever spoken about. "John," she began, her voice cracking under the weight of unspoken words, "there's something I need to tell you." The room went still. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause, waiting for whatever secret lay hidden behind those 6 decades of smiles and laughter. John leaned forward, his brow furrowing. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear what came next, but deep down, he knew he had to. And so, as the amber glow faded into twilight, the first crack appeared in the foundation of their seemingly perfect life. Little did they know, it would lead them both on a journey unlike anything they'd ever imagined. Let's rewind just a little, shall we? Picture this: the golden hour fading into twilight, shadows stretching across the Wilsons' dining table like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Martha hesitated, her frail hands trembling slightly as she gripped her teacup. You could almost feel the weight of her unspoken words hanging in the air. "John," she began again, her voice cracking under the pressure of decades-old guilt, "I need to tell you something." And then it came, the truth that would change everything. While John had been working in Detroit early in their marriage, away from home, trying to provide for their growing family, Martha had made a terrible mistake. Lonely and overwhelmed, she let herself fall into an affair. Worse still, she became pregnant. Now imagine this: John sitting there, his mind racing back to those years when he'd worked long hours in Detroit, missing Martha every single day. He thought they were building a future together, brick by brick. But here she was, telling him that during that time, she had given birth to a baby boy, and never told him. Not only that, but she gave the child up for adoption. The room seemed to shrink around them. John felt as if the floor had dropped out beneath him. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched on the table. The betrayal cut deep, sharper than any knife. How could she keep this from him for 60 years? But even in his anger, John saw the pain in Martha's eyes. She wasn't excusing herself, she was begging for forgiveness. "I thought it was the only way to protect us," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, all John could do was breathe, deep, measured breaths, as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Finally, he asked, "Why now, Martha? Why are you telling me this now?" Her answer hit him like a ton of bricks: "Because I can't take it to my grave." "You deserve to know the truth, John. Even if it's the hardest thing I'll ever ask of you." That night, as Martha lay in bed, John sat alone in the living room, staring at the old records she'd pulled from a dusty box. Birth certificates, adoption papers, letters from the adoptive family, it was all there, proof of a son he never knew existed. And here's the twist: despite the storm of emotions raging inside him, betrayal, sadness, anger, he felt something else stirring. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find the missing piece of his life. Let me paint a picture for you here. The morning sun filtered through half-drawn curtains, casting soft golden beams across John's modest bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly as he held a stack of faded documents, birth certificates, adoption papers, letters from decades ago. These weren't just pieces of paper, they were fragments of a life he never knew existed. You see, sleep hadn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could think about was Martha's confession. "I gave him up for adoption," she had said, her voice breaking under the weight of 60 years of guilt. And now, here he was, staring at these records, trying to piece together a puzzle that felt almost impossible to solve. John took a deep breath, steadying himself. "All right," he muttered under his breath, "one step at a time." The first stop. The city library, a place where countless stories lay hidden in dusty archives and microfilm machines. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. Hours passed as John scrolled through old directories, school records, and newspaper clippings. His fingers traced over names and dates, searching for any mention of Michael Reynolds. The name Martha had whispered like a prayer. Finally, something caught his eye. A small article from 1978 in the Chicago Tribune. It mentioned a science fair winner named Michael Reynolds, adopted son of Richard and Angela Reynolds. Could this be him? The boy who shared his blood, the man who carried part of John's legacy without even knowing it? John's heart raced. This was it. This was the lead he'd been hoping for. But with each clue came a fresh wave of anxiety. What if Michael didn't want to meet him? What if he rejected John outright? These thoughts gnawed at him, but John pushed forward, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. That evening, as he drove home, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Sitting at the kitchen table, John spread out the documents he'd collected. Martha joined him quietly, watching as he pieced together the scant clues. "I found something," he said at last, his tone cautious but determined. A name, Michael Reynolds. He would have been a teenager in the late 70s. "It's not much, but it's a start." Martha placed a hand over his, her touch gentle yet firm. "You're doing the right thing, John." And so, armed with nothing more than determination and a handful of fragile leads, John prepared to take the next step. Little did he know, this journey would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. All right, let's dive into this moment. It's one of those scenes that feels like it's ripped straight out of a movie. Picture it. John had spent hours sitting in his car outside Michael's office building, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He watched through the glass doors as Michael moved with confidence, laughing with colleagues and exuding warmth. This was his son, his flesh and blood, and yet, they were strangers separated by decades of silence. John knew he couldn't just barge in. No, this needed to be handled carefully. When Michael finally stepped outside, heading toward a nearby cafe, John followed at a distance. His heart pounded like a drum roll as he approached him. "Excuse me," John said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Do you mind if I join you for a moment?" Michael looked up, slightly puzzled but polite. "Sure, go ahead." John sat down across from him, the weight of 60 years pressing down on him like a lead blanket. For a few minutes, they exchanged small talk about the city and architecture, safe topics, nothing too personal. But John could feel the clock ticking. This wasn't why he was here. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Michael," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I have something important to tell you. Something about your past." Michael frowned slightly, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" John hesitated, then said, "I believe I'm your biological father." The words hung in the air like thunderclouds. Michael stared at John, his expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The bustling noise of the cafe seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the heavy silence between them. "What?" Michael finally managed, his voice low. almost a whisper. "I know this is a lot to take in," John continued, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. "And I didn't want to just drop this on you like this, but it's the truth. I have to believe that I'm your biological father." Michael leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as if trying to process the statement. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you're trying to do, but this has to be some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake," John said gently but firmly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded documents he'd carried with him since leaving home. Sliding them across the table, he added, "These will explain everything." Michael hesitated, his hand hovering over the papers before finally picking them up. As he unfolded the first page, a birth certificate with his name on it, his brows furrowed. Then came the adoption records, followed by a letter written in Martha's careful handwriting. "What is this?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "It's the truth," John replied. "I didn't know about you until a few weeks ago. Your mother, my wife, she kept it from me for decades. But when she finally told me, I knew I had to find you." Michael set the papers down, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "You're saying my mom, Angela, she wasn't my biological mom? That she adopted me?" John nodded. "Angela and Richard Reynolds, they gave you a good life, from what I've been able to see. And I'm grateful for that. But yes, your biological mother is Martha Wilson. And he paused, swallowing hard. "I'm your biological father." Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is insane. I mean, who does this? Who shows up out of nowhere claiming to be someone's father?" "I know it's a lot," John said, his voice tinged with desperation. "But I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted to meet you. To let you know the truth." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Michael folded the papers and handed them back to John. "I need time," he said quietly. "I need time to think about all of this." John nodded, relief and sadness mixing in his expression. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Here's my number in case you want to talk." Michael slipped the slip of paper into his pocket without another word, then stood up. "I have to go," he said, his tone distant. "I have a lot to process." As Michael walked away, John sat alone at the table, the weight of the encounter settling over him like a heavy cloak. But even amidst the uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope. Michael hadn't rejected him outright. There was still a chance. All right, let's dive deeper into this emotional roller coaster. Picture this. John sat alone at the cafe table, his hands trembling slightly as he watched Michael walk away. The weight of their encounter pressed down on him like a storm cloud refusing to break. He replayed every word in his mind, Michael's disbelief, his anger, his quiet retreat. But here's the thing about life, it doesn't stop, no matter how heavy the moment feels. And neither did John. Despite the uncertainty, he clung to one small glimmer of hope. Michael hadn't walked away forever. He'd taken John's number. That tiny act meant something, a crack in the door where light might still seep through. A few days passed, and John found himself pacing the house, replaying their conversation over and over. Had he said too much? Too little? Should he have waited longer before approaching Michael? These questions gnawed at him, but Martha offered a steadying presence. "You did the right thing," she told him one evening, her voice soft but firm. "You gave him space. That's all you can do now." John nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "I just wish I knew what he was thinking." Then finally, the phone rang. John practically leapt across the room to answer it, his heart pounding like a drum roll. "Hello," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and nerves. "John," came the voice on the other end. It was Michael. For a moment, John couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, relief washed over him. "Yes, Michael. It's me." "I've thought about what you said," Michael continued, his tone measured but not unkind. "And I have questions, a lot of them." John exhaled sharply, the tension melting from his shoulders. "Of course. I'll answer anything you want to know." "Can we meet again?" Michael asked. "Somewhere quieter this time." John felt a tear slip down his cheek, though he couldn't help but smile. "I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much." The second meeting took place in a park, far removed from the noise of the city. It was late afternoon, the golden hour casting long shadows across the grass. John waited on a bench, clutching his coat tightly around him. His breath misted in the crisp autumn air as he watched Michael approach. Even from a distance, Michael's presence commanded attention. Tall, confident, and carrying a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, he moved with purpose. But as he drew closer, John noticed the hesitation in his eyes, the same uncertainty that mirrored his own. "John," Michael said, his voice steady but softer than before. "Michael," John replied, rising from the bench. He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Thanks for coming." Michael sat down, setting the satchel on the ground between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Instead, they gazed out at the park, watching children laugh and leaves rustle in the breeze. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was contemplative, as if they were both searching for the right words to bridge the chasm between them. Finally, Michael broke the quiet. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you told me. About you, about Martha, about everything. I didn't know about my own life." John nodded, his throat tight. "I imagine it's a lot to process." "It is," Michael admitted. "When you showed up at the cafe, I was angry, not just at you, but at the idea that my whole life wasn't what I thought it was. Angela and Richard, they were my parents in every way that mattered. They gave me a good life, a loving home. But now I know there's this whole other part of my story, and I don't know how to feel about it." John looked down at his hands, weathered by years of hard work and love. "I'm not here to replace them," he said quietly. "I don't want to take away from the love you had with them. I wanted to know you. To at least have the chance to connect, even if it's just for a little while." Michael exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've already given me a lot to think about. But I have questions, about Martha, about you, about why she decided to give me up." John nodded, determination settling over him. "I'll answer anything you want to know." For the next hour, they talked. John shared stories about his life with Martha, their early struggles, the love they built over 6 decades. He explained her decision to give Michael up, not as a rejection, but as a desperate attempt to protect him during a time when their lives were filled with uncertainty and hardship. Michael listened intently, his skepticism gradually giving way to understanding. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive her for keeping this from me," he admitted. "But I can see why she did it. And I think I want to meet her." John's heart swelled with relief. That would mean the world to her. All right, let's keep diving into this emotional journey. Picture it. The park was quiet that afternoon, bathed in the soft amber glow of golden hour. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the coming winter, and leaves crunched underfoot as Michael approached John on the bench. There was a tension in his posture, but also something softer, a flicker of curiosity that hadn't been there before. John stood as Michael drew near, offering a small tentative smile. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. Michael nodded, sitting down beside him. He placed the leather satchel he'd been carrying on the ground between them, its weight symbolic of the questions he carried. For a moment, neither spoke. Instead, they sat side by side, watching children play in the distance, their laughter echoing faintly through the stillness. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I've thought about what you told me," he began, his tone measured but tinged with emotion. "About you, about Martha, about everything." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You have to understand, I didn't know any of this. My whole life, I thought Angela and Richard were my parents in every way that mattered. They are my parents in so many ways." John nodded, his expression understanding. "I'm not here to take that away from you, son. What they gave you, a loving home, stability, love, they did right by you. I can see that. But now," Michael continued, his voice quieter, almost hesitant, "there's this whole other part of my story. And I don't know how to feel about it." John leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly together. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. All I want is to help you understand, to give you the pieces of your past that belong to you." Michael exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Why did she do it?" he asked finally, his voice breaking slightly. "Why did Martha give me up? Was it because she didn't want me?" The question hit John like a punch to the gut. He hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "No, Michael. It wasn't because she didn't want you. It was because she loved you too much to risk losing everything else. Me, our family, the life we were trying to build. Back then, things were different. We didn't have much, and the idea of raising a child outside of marriage," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It terrified her. She thought giving you up was the only way to protect us all." Michael stared at him, his jaw tightening as he processed the words. "So she just erased me?" "No," John said firmly, leaning closer. "She never forgot you. Not once. Every year on your birthday, she would sit by herself, staring at the adoption papers. She cried more times than I can count. But she thought she was doing the right thing, for you, for us. And now," his voice softened, trembling slightly, "now she wants nothing more than to meet you. To apologize, if you'll let her." For a long moment, Michael didn't respond. He looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip below the trees, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and pink. The weight of John's words settled over him, heavy but somehow comforting. "I don't know if I can forgive her," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I understand why she did it." John felt a lump rise in his throat. "That's all she's asking for, Michael. Just a chance to explain, to make amends." Michael turned to look at him, his eyes searching John's face for answers. "What happens next?" John smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. "That's up to you. But if you're willing, I'd like to introduce you to her. She's waited 60 years for this moment." Michael hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay. Let's do it." All right, let's step into one of the most emotionally charged moments of this story. Picture it. The air was cool and crisp as Michael pulled up to John and Martha's modest home, a place that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. He stepped out of his car, clutching the leather satchel he'd brought with him, filled with photos of his own family. His heart pounded like a drum roll, each beat echoing the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just any meeting. This was the moment he would finally come face to face with the woman who had given him life, and then let him go. John greeted him at the door, his expression a mix of nervousness and quiet pride. "She's been waiting for you," he said softly, stepping aside to let Michael in. The house smelled faintly of roses and freshly baked bread, a comforting aroma that seemed to wrap around Michael like a warm blanket. Martha sat in her favorite armchair near the window, a soft blanket draped over her lap. Her frail frame and tired eyes spoke volumes about the toll her illness had taken, but there was still a spark in her gaze, a flicker of hope that lit up her entire being when she saw Michael standing in the doorway. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with emotion. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, her fingers fragile yet firm. Michael hesitated for just a moment before crossing the room and kneeling beside her. Taking her hand in his, he said quietly, "You don't have to apologize, Martha. I understand now. You did what you thought was best." Tears streamed down Martha's cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me this moment." For the first time in decades, the guilt that had weighed so heavily on Martha's heart began to lift. The evening unfolded with laughter, stories, and shared memories. Michael showed her pictures of his wife and children, pointing out their quirks and talents with obvious pride. Martha listened intently, her eyes shining with tears of joy as she absorbed every detail. John watched from the corner of the room, his heart swelling with gratitude. Their once quiet home, which had carried the silent weight of secrets for so long, was now alive with warmth and connection. It was as if the walls themselves could breathe easier now that the truth had been spoken and forgiveness, however tentative, had begun to take root. As the night wore on, Michael found himself lingering over old photo albums John had pulled from the closet. There were pictures of John and Martha as young newlyweds, their smiles radiant despite the hardships they faced. Other photos showed their children growing up, birthdays celebrated, holidays cherished. Slowly, Michael began to see the life he might have had, and the love that had always been waiting for him, even if it had been hidden behind years of silence. "This is beautiful," Michael said quietly, running his fingers over a faded picture of Martha standing in the garden, her hands full of roses. "It feels real. Like I'm finally part of something I didn't know I was missing." Martha smiled through her tears. "You've always been part of us, Michael. Always." All right, let's keep diving deeper into this emotional journey. Picture it, Michael had started visiting more regularly now, bringing his wife Sarah and their two children, Emily, a bright-eyed 10-year-old, and Jacob, a curious 7-year-old, with him. At first, these visits were tentative, like dipping toes into unfamiliar waters. But as weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to happen. Laughter replaced the lingering silence that had once filled John and Martha's home. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The house, which had carried decades of quiet memories, suddenly buzzed with activity. Emily would race through the living room, her giggles echoing off the walls, while Jacob followed close behind, clutching a toy car in one hand and a cookie in the other. Sarah brought warmth to every corner she touched, rearranging photo frames or helping Martha tend to her beloved rose garden during her final days. Martha, though frail, seemed to find new life in these moments. She'd sit in her favorite armchair near the window, bundled up in a soft blanket, watching the chaos unfold around her with tears of joy streaming down her face. "It's like having my family back," she whispered to John one evening as they sat together on the porch. "All of it." And then there were the meals, long hearty dinners where stories flowed freely across generations. One night, Michael shared how he'd always felt drawn to architecture because of its permanence, its ability to create structures that stood the test of time. "But now I realize," he said, smiling softly at John, "that families are kind of like buildings. They're made stronger when everyone works together to fix what's broken." John nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've got that right, son." Evenings often ended with old records playing softly in the background, the same melodies John and Martha had danced to in their youth. Michael noticed this ritual and asked about it one night. "That song," he said, pointing to the record player, "it feels familiar somehow." John chuckled, a deep, warm sound that filled the room. "That's our song," he explained, glancing at Martha. "We played it at our wedding. It was the first dance we ever shared. Martha smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. Michael looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time, he saw not just an elderly couple bound by years of love, but two people who had fought through storms most couldn't imagine. He felt a pang of guilt for holding on to his anger for so long, and a surge of gratitude for choosing forgiveness instead. As the weeks passed, Martha's health continued to decline. Yet, even as her body grew weaker, her spirit remained strong. She cherished every moment with Michael, asking endless questions about his work, his marriage, his dreams for the future. "You remind me so much of John when we were younger," she told him one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was always so determined, so full of hope. Just like you." Michael squeezed her hand gently, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for telling me, Martha. For letting me know who I am." Her response was simple but profound. "You've always been ours, Michael. Always." Finally, the inevitable arrived. On a crisp autumn morning, surrounded by her husband, son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, Martha passed away peacefully. Her final breaths were calm, her expression serene, as if she knew her mission in this world had been completed. In those last moments, she reached out to hold John's hand, her touch light but deliberate, before closing her eyes for the final time. In the days that followed, grief settled heavily over the household. But amidst the sorrow, there was also a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that Martha's legacy would live on through the connection she had worked so hard to rebuild. The funeral was intimate, attended only by close family and friends. As John stood beside Michael, listening to the pastor speak about love, sacrifice, and redemption, he felt Martha's presence all around him, in the rustling leaves, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees, and the way Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Afterward, as they drove home from the cemetery, no one spoke. Words weren't necessary. The weight of loss hung in the air, but so did the knowledge that Martha had left behind something extraordinary, a fractured family made whole again. All right, let's step into one of the most reflective and heartfelt moments of this story. Picture it. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves as John and Michael sat together on the porch. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep hues of purple and orange before surrendering to the encroaching night. Stars began to peek through the darkening canvas above them, their light soft but steady, much like the bond that was slowly forming between father and son. John leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood familiar and comforting. He glanced at Michael, who sat beside him, his elbows resting on his knees as he gazed out at the yard. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was contemplative, filled with unspoken emotions and shared memories they were only beginning to build. "You know," John began, his voice low but warm, "I never thought I'd get this chance, to know you, to have you in my life." He paused, swallowing hard as emotion tightened his throat. "Your mother, Martha, she gave me that gift. And I'll be forever grateful." Michael turned to look at him, his expression softening. There was still a trace of the skepticism he'd carried during their first meeting, but now it was tempered by something else, understanding, maybe even gratitude. "She gave us both a second chance," he said quietly, his tone thoughtful. "Not just you, John. Me too." John nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, son. That's exactly right." For a long moment, neither spoke. Instead, they sat side by side, watching as the first stars emerged in the twilight sky. It was Michael who broke the silence next, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you ever wonder what might have been? If she hadn't given me up, I mean." John exhaled slowly, considering the question. "All the time," he admitted. "But then I think about Angela and Richard, the life they gave you, the love they poured into you, and I realize something. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, But sometimes, those detours lead us to places we're meant to be. Michael smiled faintly, nodding. I guess that's true. They were amazing parents. I wouldn't trade them for anything. He hesitated, then added, but finding you, knowing where I came from, it feels like I'm finally whole. Like I've found a missing piece I didn't even know I was looking for. John reached over, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. You've always been part of us, son. Always. Even when we didn't know about each other, you were still here, in our hearts, in our stories. Now we just get to make new ones together. The simplicity of those words struck a chord in Michael. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of work, and remembered the photographs he'd seen in John and Martha's home, their wedding day, holidays celebrated, birthdays marked with laughter and love. For so long, he'd felt like an outsider looking in. But now he belonged. As the night deepened, the two men stayed on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. They shared stories about their lives, the challenges they'd faced, the joys they'd experienced, the lessons they'd learned along the way. John spoke fondly of Martha, recounting tales of her kindness, her strength, and her unwavering love. Michael listened intently, piecing together the portrait of the woman who had given him life, and then made the ultimate sacrifice to protect it. Finally, as the temperature dropped and the stars grew brighter, Michael stood, stretching slightly. I should probably head home, he said, though his tone suggested reluctance. Sarah and the kids are waiting. John nodded, rising to his feet as well. Thank you for coming tonight, Michael. For staying. It means more than I can say. Michael offered a small smile, his gaze steady. Thank you, John. For finding me. For giving us a chance to do this, to be family. With that they embraced, a gesture simple yet profound, sealing the connection they had fought so hard to rebuild. As Michael walked to his car, John watched him go, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. In that moment, under a sky dotted with countless stars, John felt true peace. All right, let's bring this incredible story to its final heartfelt chapter. Picture it, weeks had passed since Martha's passing, but her presence lingered in every corner of the Wilson home. The roses in the garden still bloomed vibrantly, as if defying the cold winds of autumn. Inside, the house was quieter now, but not empty. It carried the echoes of laughter and connection that Michael, Sarah, and their children had brought into John's life. John stood on the porch one evening, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the trees. He felt a profound mix of emotions, grief for Martha, gratitude for Michael, and an overwhelming sense of peace. This wasn't how he'd imagined his twilight years, but somehow it felt right. Michael walked up beside him, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Thought you could use this, he said with a small smile, handing one to John. Thanks, son, John replied, taking the mug. His voice caught slightly on the word son, but he didn't try to hide it. The truth was, saying that word no longer felt foreign. It felt natural, like breathing. They stood there together, sipping their coffee in companionable silence as the sky turned from amber to deep indigo. Finally, Michael spoke. You know, I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately, he said softly. About everything she did, for me, for you, for all of us. John nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She was always stronger than she looked, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Even when she made mistakes, even when she carried secrets, she did it all because she loved us. Michael sighed, leaning against the railing. I don't think I'll ever fully understand why she thought she had to keep me a secret. But I do know one thing, I'm glad you found me. Glad we got the chance to fix what was broken. John turned to look at him, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Me too, son. Me too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Instead, they simply stood there, side by side, watching as the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky. It was Michael who broke the silence again. "You think she's watching us now?" he asked quietly, glancing upward. "I do," John replied without hesitation. "And I think she's smiling." As the days turned into months, John and Michael grew closer than either of them could have imagined. They shared stories, worked together in the garden, and even took road trips to explore parts of the country neither had seen before. Michael introduced John to modern technology, teaching him how to use a smartphone so they could stay connected more easily, and John taught Michael the value of slowing down, appreciating the little things, and finding joy in simplicity. One afternoon, while flipping through an old photo album, Michael came across a picture of John and Martha on their wedding day. They looked so young, so full of hope. He stared at it for a long time before turning to John. "What do you think she'd say if she saw us now?" he asked. John smiled, his expression softening. "She'd probably tell me to stop being so stubborn and remind you to call your mother-in-law more often." Michael laughed, shaking his head. "Sounds about right." But beneath the humor, there was a deeper truth. Martha's legacy lived on, not just in the memories they shared, but in the way her actions had ultimately brought them together. Her decision to reveal the secret hadn't been easy, but it had paved the way for healing, forgiveness, and love. One crisp winter morning, John received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed copy of a letter Michael had written, a heartfelt tribute to Martha and the sacrifices she'd made. At the bottom, Michael had added a single line: "Family isn't defined by blood or circumstance. It's built on love, trust, and the courage to face the truth." Tears welled up in John's eyes as he read those words. He placed the frame on the mantel, next to a photograph of Martha surrounded by roses. That evening, as he sat by the fire with Michael, Emily, and Jacob playing nearby, John felt a deep sense of contentment. Life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned, but maybe that was the beauty of it. Sometimes, the most unexpected detours lead to the places we're meant to be. And as the flames danced on the hearth, casting warm golden light across the room, John realized something. Martha hadn't just given him 60 years of love, she'd given him a lifetime of hope.
And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.